Hi, I'm Jay Allen Sanford from the San Diego Reader, and we're here to talk about another episode of the 1950s television anthology Tales of Tomorrow. I've written for magazines like Starlog, FilmFax, and Midnight Marquee, and the Reader published my in-depth history of this program a while back. This episode of Tales of Tomorrow, Fury of the Cocoon, was broadcast live as it was performed March 6, 1953, on an ABC network soundstage on East 66th Street in New York City. It opens with an announcer, Raymond Edward Johnson, setting the general scene and telling us how the world of tomorrow is going to be filled with wondrous things. And I think this is because so many episodes of the series feature people getting killed, including whole civilizations and planets. And my guess is that this optimistic introduction is kind of a concession to the sponsors who paid for the program. Only a handful of episodes have this brief introduction, and this is kind of a dark, death-filled episode, not likely to leave people thinking about new jewelry or wall-to-wall carpeting, why they probably tacked it on. So as we open, we find that a scientific expedition has been sent out to investigate the site of a reported meteorite impact. And they're out in the African jungle somewhere. And that first team apparently went missing, so a relief team has been sent in search of the expedition's camp and to find out what happened. And we're looking now at the abandoned outpost. We see a nice sweeping shot of the expedition cabin. We see it's outfitted with all sorts of jungle survival gear, pots and pans, a radio, lots of scientific looking junk. And actually it's a fairly well-dressed set considering these shows were such low budget. And we gradually close in on, we're not really sure quite what that is yet, but we will find out soon. So we cut to the jungle, and we're going to meet the two members of our search party. They're walking around calling out for a missing professor, and they're also calling out for someone named Susan. And we see right from the start that this guy here, bringing up the rear, Brannigan, he's being a real asshole. He starts right off just complaining up a storm, and we find out fairly quickly they're running 15 days late, which doesn't really bode well for the missing scientists they're searching for, because they're late because Brannigan here was being so mean to their native tribesmen that were carrying their gear they used to have a whole bunch of these guys when they started off, but Brannigan treated them all like slaves, and all the native guides quit except for one. And that left them over 2 weeks late, and they're just now getting close to the original campsite. So the other guy actually here, Borden, he's so pissed off at the asshole that he promises to press charges against him as soon as they get back to civilization. That's the brunt of their argument here. The asshole guy that I mentioned there, Peter Capell, he's played by a German actor that you may recognize as the Tinker from 1971's Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Capell was already doing genre TV back in 1950 with anthology shows like The Web, The Clock, Lights Out, Dimension X. And from Tales of Tomorrow, he'd go on to do ones like Inner Sanctum, Suspense, and hundreds of other TV shows and movies right up until the mid-'80s. The other guy here, Borden, is Cameron Prudhomme. And he's a player in Hollywood as far back as 1930. He appeared in the film Abraham Lincoln, later played Professor Henry Spangler in Back from Eternity in 1956. Also has a prominent role in The Cardinal in 1963. Like Peter Capell, he also did a lot of anthology TV shows, a lot of the same ones like The Clock, Dimension X, Suspense, and The Web. And he'd actually be in a total of 5 Tales of Tomorrow episodes. I'll tell you a little bit about the writer. This actually happens to be the first Tales of Tomorrow that's scripted by Frank De Felitta, who'd go on to write over a dozen more original episodes. De Felitta would later be known for his novels Audrey Rose in 1975 and The Entity in 1978, both of which he also adapted for successful films. De Felitta got to start scripting for the weekly radio thriller The Whistler before he took jobs writing TV shows like Your Jeweler's Showcase, Plymouth Playhouse, Suspense, Armstrong Circle Theater. He did Medallion Theater, later known as General Electric Theater, and there he actually worked with Tales of Tomorrow producer Mort Abrahams. He did Campbell's Summer Soundstage, which, like Tales of Tomorrow, offered a role to a young James Dean. And Frank De Felitta eventually became in demand as a genuine triple threat. He was a writer and a producer and a director. He went on to write for noted anthologies like Studio One, where Rod Serling was working for a while, and he earned Emmy nods in 1963 and 1968 for his documentaries. Also won a Peabody Award, and he won several Writers Guild Awards. Our director, somebody he worked with fairly often on Tales of Tomorrow, his name's Don Medford, and he directed around 35 episodes of Tales of Tomorrow. Medford scripted nearly 100 TV shows through his career, including 5 episodes of The Twilight Zone, as well as Alfred Hitchcock Presents and the final episode of The Fugitive, which in 1967 was one of the most watched TV broadcasts in history, viewed by something like 78 million people. He also did nearly 36 episodes of the FBI, a couple dozen Berettas, Dynasty, Mrs. Columbo, Airwolf. Did the final episode of the 1980s TV series The Colbys. He also occasionally scripted and produced the shows he worked on as well. I would say Don Medford's Twilight Zones are probably the closest to the work that you see him do here on Tales of Tomorrow. He helmed A Passage for Trumpet with Jack Klugman. That was the Genie episode. He did The Mirror with Peter Falk. I did Death's Head Revisited, Concentration Camp 1, and the hour-long episode Death Ship from *63. So here the native has found one of the victims outside the cabin. They didn't starve because the cabin was full of food. But notice that we can't show on 60s TV or 50s TV, you know, how bloody and horrible the two bodies are. They've had their throat pierced. They were drained of every drop of blood by some leech of an animal, this guy says. But look at the nice lighting here. We just see this through their eyes. And it is genuinely creepy, isn't it? I mean, though working within a low budget, Medford really makes the most of what he's got here. So they have found here the two of the people they were looking for, and as I say, they think it's some leech of an animal since they've been completely drained. They occurs to them, where's the other person they were looking for, though? This person, Susan. Well, what do you know? To the accompaniment of a nice violin-heavy soundtrack, the missing Susan comes stumbling out of the jungle, and she's muttering something about run and hide. There are hundreds of them. And then she makes a lot of weird noises and really kind of creeping us out and them, shaking her hands around like something's attacking her. Yikes. This is actually, I'll introduce her now. This is Nancy Coleman. She came from a radio background. She appeared in movies like The Gay Sisters in 1942 before becoming a regular face on television in the 1950s. She did a total of 3 Tales of Tomorrows, as well as similar anthology shows like The Web, Lights Out, Lux Video Theater. She was actually retired through most of the 60s, but then turned up in a few more TV movies in the 70s. Of course, Brannigan here still being an asshole to the native guide, we say, who, by the way, is uncredited. I was unable to find out this actor's name for you, even in the age of the Internet Movie Database. But we now go back to the cabin, which Don Medford has starts off with a nice tight shot, pulls back, and we see Susan's passed out, no doubt worn out because we know she's been weeks on the run from something or other, hundreds of something or other out here in the jungle. Asshole Brannigan here starts reading the original expedition scientific notes, and they found the books tell that the team was being terrorized by hundreds of giant blood-sucking insects from outer space, who apparently arrived here via that meteorite that they'd been sent out to investigate. And well, even though these are giant insects, they're particularly hard to avoid because they're invisible, just like Arnold Schwarzenegger's later interstellar jungle foe, the Predator, I guess. And the notes inform them that the doomed scientists captured one of the invisible creatures, and they ascertain somehow or other that it lives on blood, and it particularly seems to like human blood, which it presumably never had the opportunity to taste back on their home planet. And and the scientists also say that before they all got massacred by these invisible bugs from outer space, they made a plaster cast out of the invisible monster. So I should share something with you here that writer Frank De Felitta told me when I interviewed him about this episode for my thriller articles, or for my Tales of Tomorrow articles. And he said, quote, I was told the ratings actually increased on the Cocoon. That night it got a good rating, better than the week before. I know the sponsors, the Chrysler Company, were having trouble with the stories, that there was some sameness to them, and they wanted to open up to other writers with other ideas, unquote. He also recalled for me his initial meeting with Tales of Tomorrow producer Mort Abrahams. He told me, quote, that interview consisted mainly of him telling me how tough it was to find writers who wrote the kind of material they were looking for, who could write it well. He had found 4 or 5 writers that he thought were terrific, and he was satisfied to give them all of the shows. I said, would you accept a script on spec? He said, of course. If I had the time, I'll read it. And I went home and wrote The Cocoon, got it to him, and he loved it. He said it would make a scary script, but it was awfully difficult to get him to buy it, unquote. And De Felitta says that some time went by before someone else from the show actually called to tell him they did want to purchase the story after all. And When I interviewed De Felitta in the late 1980s, he told me about having the idea for this script, basing it on one of the biggest science fiction films in theater that year. That was actually The Thing from Another World. And he said, when I saw that, quote, when I saw it, I came up with an idea for a show that would be like The Thing. I called it The Cocoon, which I wrote patterned after The Thing. There was an object from another world and an invisible creature, and I had an awfully good time writing it. Well, here they found the plaster cast finally, and we get these great close-ups of them and their frightened eyes, and here's the cast of the creature, and which is what the original expedition was so scared of. Boy, oh boy, we can see why. That's beautiful, huh? So now we get to see what the creature looks like, and we get to hear what it sounds like when they attack, because outside, the lone native helper is screaming, apparently being violently murdered off screen. And of course, again, something we're not going to be able to see on 1950s television, but his death is made all the more creepy by not being seen, other than really in the close-up of the terrified expression here, which is really nice. I mean, right down to the sweat breaking out on his brow here and his terrified eyes. So whatever he's looking at, it is pretty damn scary looking. Don Medford really was a hell of a director, even with zero production dollars. So he beats feet back inside, and it's no wonder that I guess the first thing he does here is take a slug of booze, because that pretty much on this show always means that you're doomed, by the way. So his fate's kind of sealed by that. And there really is a palpable tension here. There's not a whole lot of music, but what little there is sort of Hitchcockian, mainly strings. And here, as they contemplate what's in store for them outside the cabin, it's getting creepier and creepier. There's hundreds of giant invisible alien insects swarming the jungle and jonesing for another taste of that sweet human Earthman blood they just discovered. Susan and Solan, they're muttering these dire warnings and just generally scaring the shit out of them even more. And the soundtrack here is put to good use. It is one of their original scores. It wasn't just canned music they found in the network library. A little crashing and thundering, and then a little sort of an insectoid sound, this sort of humming sound that I suspect they borrowed from the movie Them. And just generally an increasingly uneasy atmosphere, genuinely creepy television. And here's our announcer again, Raymond Edward Johnson. He's offering his little disclaimer that these are the works of speculative fiction, and they're a look beyond what real life is actually like. And really, by the time this time in the show was run, the network had probably accumulated a lot of complaint letters from viewers that were upset that they're eating their frozen dinners in front of the TV, and all of a sudden they're served up with an apocalyptic, world-ending plague or something. And the announcer here almost seems to be apologizing for this, or at least he places the blame on the imagination of the writers and the show creators and their boundless creativity. And the emphasis in these little disclaimers is that the show only enacts what could be rather than what will be, which really, if you think about it, is pretty similar to what Rod Serling tried to do each week on screen in his later Twilight Zone series. So Frank De Felitta, another thing he told me was, and I'll read this quote, I thought that Tales of Tomorrow was the best of the live television shows at the time. I came onto the show later. I loved it. I used to watch it, and what was amazing to me was the ability of this program to deliver on live television the quality of an edited motion picture. At that time, I was interested in film, and television was simply a stepping stone to film for me, or at least that's what I wished it to be. It was so soon after the advent of television, everyone was playing the medium like a toy. It was such fun, and yet it was crude. Everything they did was crude. It was like playing with something they weren't quite familiar with. And the nature of the pictures that would come out, the finished product, would always be, to me anyway, kind of corny, not quite up to the par of a motion picture. Never did quite measure up to the quality and the fluidity of perfection that only movies can give you. And then one time I saw an episode of Tales of Tomorrow. It had been on, I guess. I just never saw it, and I was amazed at the fantastic quality of the show, at least compared to the ones I'd been working on. And I immediately called my agent at the time and told him I wanted to write for that program, and he said no, it was impossible because they didn't take outside writers. They had sort of a stable of writers. It was difficult to get in, unquote. And I should note here that Frank De Felitta never did waver in his praise for Tales of Tomorrow. I'll read you one last quote of his here. He said, I owe a great deal to the show. It got me into the area that I've been working in. It was absolutely a wonderful experience. I was sorry when it went off the air. Some years ago, Mort and I went to a seminar where we showed The Window, and it was amazing how well it stood up, unquote. And he said that the respect given to the creators of Tales of Tomorrow was really kind of a rare and rewarding thing. He Later he took a turn at directing. He did a well-regarded 1981 TV movie called Dark Night of the Scarecrow. That's widely considered one of the best scarecrow horror stories ever filmed. He also did Paramount's 1991 Sharon Stone thriller Scissors, and he did the book and the screenplay for The Entity, 1978 horror novel and a 1982 film. Although he didn't direct that one, Sidney Furie directed it. And that film was responsible for the reemergence of Barbara Hershey. Frank De Felitta did the Audrey Rose film sequel, by the way. That appeared in the early 80s. He produced and he directed the first one of those. He passed away in 2016, Frank De Felitta. And back to the show here. We're back to our heroes. They're really one hero, a survivor, and a complete asshole. And they're looking around because they realize that the invisible creatures, for all they know, they might be inside there somewhere. The atmosphere is that pensive and anticipatory. It's nerve-wracking. The three of them are arguing. They argue, should they run for it? Should they barricade themselves in? Is there any point in really doing anything? And these creatures are invisible. They could be anywhere. They do have some weapons handy, and they tell us that the bugs could already be inside the cabin, and that if they even think something's moving, they should just grab a gun and shoot it. But then, because we still have a few minutes to kill, they take a nap while Susan lays here and she mutters a few things, and we've got the asshole sound asleep. And unfortunately, their suspicions are correct because these creatures are invisible. They can indeed get inside when they're not aware of it. And why they decided that this was a good time to all of them take a nap and no longer be going on watch with each other is anybody's guess. It's quite possible Frank De Felitta was on the soundstage for this. He said that they often would let the writers come in there and watch the taping live as it went out over the air. And in fact, one of the writers mentioned he was allowed to bring his girlfriend in one time, which he said really impressed her mightily. I'll read you another quote of Frank De Felitta's here. He said, quote, "I was invited to be on the soundstage as they broadcast. I later did a science fiction film called ZPG, and I take very little credit for that. I didn't really have anything to do with what ended up being made. It was a very bad job on a very wonderful script that I collaborated on with Max Elrich. Very bad job, done by a Tyro director who really shouldn't have been given the job. It was an unfortunate waste of wonderful material." He went on to say, "Writers are so vulnerable, you see. Their work is at the mercy of a director who can ride roughshod over a script, change whatever they want, and that's the way it is in movies. I did have a good experience in Audrey Rose, which I produced." Unquote. So the creature's got a hold, unfortunately, here of our asshole. And it looks like he's going to die. But for some reason or other, I guess to prove what a good guy he is, Brannigan actually does grab him, save the asshole's life, albeit off camera. Because what's happening here, we hear him saying that he's got the creature, and that would probably look silly on camera because the creature is invisible. So all we see is Susan's very believable reaction here. Again, really good staging on the part of director Don Medford. And they managed to wrangle the creature into submission. That's what we're hearing them saying. They decide, throw some rope over it. And that's making Susan here get a little braver, step a little closer so we kind of see what it is they're talking about. Which brings us to a neat little bit of off-screen special effect here that was being set up. Look at the rope here, kind of like you don't even see hardly the black strings tugging at it. The creature bound and wiggling around. That's really a pretty neat effect for 1953. So hopefully this time they're going to stay awake. Now that they've got a creature inside there with them, as we can see, they decide they're going to take turns keeping an eye on this thing. And they'll get shut-eye in shifts at this point. It remains unclear what their plan is. There must be a lot of invisible predators between them and however and wherever they first arrived in the jungle. And that was, we know, several weeks ago. They don't have the one native guide left alive. No help there. Director Don Medford, I feel, makes the most of these moments here, showing the increasing tension here. We just hear some sound effects now outside. You hear some of those insectoid sounds. Brannigan, of course, he's back to his complaining. He contemplates what the wriggling rope signifies, what's waiting for them all outside the cabin. And somehow or other, Susan's able to sleep again, but our asshole's got sweat breaking out on his brow again. He's just staring at this thing, getting more and more scared. Susan's trying to get a few Z's in. And Even though the alien, I mean, by today's standards, that does look kind of silly. Imagine yourself, and also watching this in a low resolution television in the 1950s where you don't really see the strings. So Brennigan stays true to character here. He's clearly ready to prove just what a dumbass he really is. He eventually loses it here, and he's taking everything down. He's going to try to run out the door, even though it's obvious that that's probably what killed everyone before him, other than Lucky Susan that they found. And this turns out to be, of course, another bad decision, and we immediately hear him firing his gun. He's yelling at something, "Get away from me." And again, everything all happening off screen, only conveyed to us via the reactions of our characters here and the sounds from outside the door. Brennigan's fate happens all off screen, and they're clearly distressed at the sound of his terrified screams and his apparently useless gunshots. Even if he did basically get what he deserved, it's still a harrowing moment. And of course, then they notice something weird, that the cocoon creature that they had all tied up, it doesn't seem to be moving anymore. So what's going on here? Looks like the creature's dead. And apparently, they look around, they see all it took was laying it down real close to a can of bug spray, which of course everyone brings to the jungle. Of course, wait, bug spray? Didn't the first expedition ever think of fighting the interstellar bugs with bug spray? But apparently not, as Borden says here. Why not? They're insects. And great resolution. Geez, if only the original team had read the labels on their cans of Raid before they put them away here. Well, luckily, there is a whole can of Raid, and Borden figures out that they can strap on as many cans of insecticide as possible and may be able to just spray their way out of the jungle. Borden says that even if the spray doesn't kill the beasties, it should at least keep them at bay, or at least as far away as a spray burst goes. What is that, at least 2 feet, maybe 3 feet? Safe air around them, spraying while they're running. Hundreds of creatures are trying to eat them, creatures they can't see. Borden says, we'll make it to the river by morning. And, well, good luck with that. They might make it, who knows? But as we approach the ending, I'm going to note again, Tales of Tomorrow was originally planned to be called Tomorrow is Yours. A little background about the show. It was traced back to an idea by science fiction author Theodore Sturgeon, who provided the story for the first episode. He was writing for astounding science fiction and weird tales and planet stories at the time. Of course, he'd later be known for scripting classic Star Trek episodes like Shore Leave and Amok Time. He did the 80s reboot of Twilight Zone and did Land of the Lost. I think there was even an episode of The Invaders based on one of his stories. And Sturgeon helped Mort Abrahams, the producer of the show, put together what they called the Science Fiction League of America, a coalition of 12 science fiction writers who provided the television rights to their published short stories. Abraham would pay the writers a weekly royalty to the league, and then the individual payments to the author of each work. So we're wrapping up here. There's a brave alternate direction that when they started hiring writers like Frank De Felitta and others to start doing these original stories, or in this case, a story inspired by The Thing from Another World. But once they got directors like Don Medford aboard and teamed up with guys like Frank De Felitta, they really had a winning formula. Well, that really wraps up another episode of Tales of Tomorrow. The announcer is going to warn us again that speculative tales are not necessarily foretelling the future. And he's going to promise us a little bit more at the same time. Next week, same station. And another tale of, hopefully, a world not getting blown up this time, so you can sell a few carpets and a few watches instead of having to have our sort of disclaimer announcer here instead. So I hope you enjoyed letting me in your ears this last 22 minutes or so, and I hope you enjoyed hearing more about this episode of Tales of Tomorrow. I really enjoy sharing these stories with you, and I really enjoy these new masters that we're seeing, although they're still kinescopes that were just film that was pointed at the camera. They're lovely transfers, and this is the best versions you'll ever see. So do enjoy.